Welcome to In Focus with Ijaz Haider. Tehran wants sanctions relief. The U.S. wants to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Russia and China back Iran with reference to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The EU partners to the deal want the U.S. to return to the deal, but are also wary of China's stepping back from its commitments under the deal. Israel remains opposed to the deal and wants Iran's nuclear infrastructure destroyed. Both Iran and the U.S. say they have an interest in reviving the JCPOA, but 6 rounds of talks in Vienna earlier this year have failed to produce a breakthrough. The election of conservative President Ebrahim Raisi in Iran has further complicated the situation. U.S. President Joe Biden is tackling multiple crises at home. Corollary, reviving the nuclear pact will be difficult. Meanwhile, Israel has been issuing threats. Just 2 days ago, Israel's military chief, Aviv Kohavi, said that military plans dealing with Iran's nuclear program have been greatly accelerated. Kohavi was referring to preparations for possible action against Iran. He also revealed that, and I'm quoting from what he said, a significant chunk of the boost to the defense budget, as was recently agreed, was intended for this purpose. So what are we looking at? To discuss this, I'm joined by Sayyid Khoseshm, journalist and analyst. He has taught at a number of Iranian universities and academic centers. Dr. Heinz Gartner, lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna and at Danube University. And Dr. Shir Hever, who's a political economist and author of the book, The Privatization of Israeli Security. Thank you to my panelists. Let me begin with Mustafa Khoseshm. Mustafa, your initial thoughts about where the situation is headed with reference A, to the deal itself, and B, the Israeli threats.
In fact, the Israelis have been threatening Tehran since 2002, when Iran's nuclear dossier was brought under the spotlight by the Americans and hues and cries started. And they were posing increasing threats up until 2007 and 8. They went to such extremes that they even alleged that they were staging drills, joint drills, in preparation for attacking Iran and Iranian nuclear facilities. But once Tehran started the first missile drills in reaction, they stepped back, and the Americans actually replaced them with military threats. Not for the sake of military action, but also, but just as part of the U.S. containment policy, which was being calibrated those days and came into play under Obama, to pressure Tehran alongside the pressure that they were posing on Tehran under the sanctions, to push Tehran to the talks to make it give concessions. And the Israeli role was confined to just terrorist attacks and sabotage, but not military attacks. Because if they had the capability, they would have done that already. Then after the JCPOA and after Donald Trump exited the deal, they went to, reinvigorate the same containment strategy components. They pushed, more sanctions on Iran and reinstated all the sanctions to peak the pressures, economic pressures. And then they also started threats. The Americans did it. But after Tehran shut down the Global Hawk, captured the British ship and Iranian missiles, rained down on Ain al-Assad, and there was no response by the United States, despite the very fact that Donald Trump had already warned to target 52 centers in Iran, then the American military threat lost credibility, and it was then that they called back Israel to help them with more threats, because the Israelis are known to be in rush, arrogant, more arrogant.
So you're basically saying that this is a tag team act where after the U.S. military threats credibility declined, they brought in the Israelis. But my point is that, the statement by the Israeli military chief is pretty specific this time.
This is a new version of, such threats. The Israelis mean to play in a space between war and peace. War, any kind of action that would trigger war, is their red line. But that doesn't mean that they would just speak. They would also go for using media warfare, also assassination, sabotage attack like what we saw at Natanz, in order to lay the pressure on Tehran and give some kind of credibility to their military threat.
I completely agree, Mustafa. The point that I'm trying to make is you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a war going on even as we speak between Iran and Israel. It's a covert war. So we are all very about where that stands, that situation. But what I'm saying is that the Israeli military chief has now said something which is pretty specific and overt.
Yeah, I know. But what I'm trying to say is, not everything could be calculated. There is a risk of accidental war. There is a risk that even Israelis cross the red line unknowingly, unwillingly, because they know the repercussions. They would be devastated.
Okay.
But what I see is that the formula they're practicing would not respond this time. Last time, it was a pro-U.S. president in Tehran. This time, President Raisi would have a different reaction. That's for sure. And what I see in Tehran is that after the election, there is no other reasoning to hold back any, response. They have always been given a reciprocal response to these security threats and, attacks.
Right. We're going to return to, Mustafa, we're going to return to that, but let me pull in Dr. Heber here. Dr. Heber, since you obviously, study Israeli policies, the entire, concept of peace, equitable settlements and so on and so forth. Give me your sense of what you make of this very specific statement by the Israeli military chief.
Yeah, specifically to this statement, we have to look at the timing, because the Israeli coalition, which is very fragile, has just managed to pass the budget in the government, but it still needs to pass within the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And it is a tradition in Israel that the Ministry of Defense always finds new and larger threats just before the budget has to pass. So Kochavi, the chief of the Israeli military, has made the speech at a very impeccable timing to ask for more money, basically. I think it's very clear. I completely agree with Mr. Hosheshen that the Israeli military is unprepared for risking their own lives and to actually go into a military conflict with Iran, which would threaten the lives of Israeli soldiers. So in fact, they're focusing on this low-intensity campaign of assassinations and sabotage, which is very technologically based. For that technology, they need money. And this money is what Kochavi wants to get from the government. So in fact, he's not calling on the Israeli public to make sacrifices and thousands of casualties in a all-out conventional war with Iran. He's talking about more of the same of what we've seen so far. And I think this is also need to be seen within the context of the very high-profile prison breakout that we've seen this week with 6 Palestinian prisoners escaping from prison. And it reveals this prison break. First of all, the fragility and the vulnerability of the Israeli security system, but also the fact that money that was spent on security and technology measures to make these prisons impregnable has not achieved its goal. And the response in the Israeli media and in the Israeli security system when they see this escape of the prisoners is, oh, we should have even more technology, more sophisticated cameras and computer systems to track the prisoners. But what is missing is the human element. And without the human element, I think the Israeli military is not really capable of engaging with Iran.
Right, that's a very important point. So just a follow-up question. So basically what you're saying is that the Israeli military chief's statement is in the service of the politicians, the civilian principals who have put together a loose and rather in many ways untenuous sort of coalition. So it should not be taken seriously in pure military terms.
They have a certain budget, and they expect him to accept the budget, but Kochavi wants more money for his soldiers, for his officers, and part of this money actually goes to their pensions, to their own pockets. So he's putting pressure on the Israeli government by threatening the Israeli public, saying, well, Iran would quickly develop a nuclear weapon which will threaten us, and unless the government gives more money to the military, to the defense apparatus, then everybody's life is at risk. This is a very known tactic in Israeli politics, and it happens pretty much every time a budget has to pass.
Very interesting. Let me pull in Dr. Heinz Gartner here. Dr. Gartner, we've talked about the Israeli threats, but let's now talk about the JCPOA talks. 6 rounds that haven't, I mean, there is clean text here and there, but by and large, the central points with reference to sequencing, with reference to what Iran has to do, what the United States has to do, hasn't really, come through. So what is your sense of where that is headed? As I said in my opening, President Biden has his own problems. Iran has a conservative right-wing president. So is this even going to be possible or is probable?
First of all, I have to underline that each of these, all of the parties, wants to have this GCPOA. So it is President Biden said this, President Raisi said this, the Europeans want it, Russia and China want it, so everybody wants the GCPOA. So it seems that there are some political and some technical obstacles here. Looking at the Vienna talks at 6 rounds we had, so what the information I have is that about 90% of the text has been agreed upon. So there are some requests of both sides, the Americans and the Iranians, which to my mind are unrealistic and should be dropped in order to get the GCPOA revitalized. The issues of the obstacles which are in the media, what the politicians of both sides stress is that Iran wants all sanctions being lifted, and it wants guarantees of the United States that the United States in the future would not withdraw like President Trump did. Both demands are not realistic. So the United States will not lift all the sanctions. So there should be the GCPOA-related sanctions, and President Biden cannot give any guarantee for the next president. So that's not possible. Also, on the American side, they still again want to go back to the requests and the points by Foreign Minister, Secretary of State Pompeo, pick up and include missiles and regional behavior, which is unrealistic as well. So there is no arms control agreement in history which includes behavior. So we wouldn't have any arms control treaty with the Soviet Union. On the contrary, it was a success if you have an arms control agreement with a state where the tensions are high, so that would be reduced the sanctions, the tensions. So the best thing would be to return to the GCPOA for everybody. Let me add 2 things. First of all, about 1,500 sanctions have been agreed upon on economics, which has an economic impact on Iran's economy. For Iran, it would be the best to seize the opportunity to have its economy, a boost for its economy, which would be sufficient. So the sooner the better for Iran. So there should be no procrastination, and I guess the Iranian politicians should think about this as well. Second, we're talking about Israel. So if there is no GCPOA, so if there is no agreement, it would be disastrous for the region, because then, of course, Israel would cry foul and say, we said it all along, Iran is building a bomb. Iran will continue with its nuclear program, enriching much more, coming close to the bomb, coming close to the breakout time, limiting the room of maneuver of the inspectors of the IAEA, maybe threatening to leave the NPT, and then Israel would say the only option what we have is a military option. And actually, when Prime Minister Bennett was visiting the White House last week, I guess, President Biden kept the military option open. He said, if diplomacy fails, we have other options. So the first thing is diplomacy, and diplomacy has to be successful, because if it fails, as President Biden says, we have the military option. And Israel will try to include and involve the United States as well. Even so, of course, President Biden would be reluctant to get involved in another Middle East war. But the only solution for all this is a successful conclusion of the JCPOA. So the better the delegations return to Vienna and finish the open 10%, which are more technical, with centrifuges, enrichment limits, duration, that can be resolved. So they should return to Vienna in order to prevent another high-risk operations in the Middle East.
I couldn't agree more with you. Thanks so much for your insights. That was Dr. Heinz Gartner. Mustafa, there are some analysts who refer to, of course, Raisi's cabinet has been approved by Parliament now, who say that there are too many ideologues in the cabinet. They're all hardliners, and that probably prefer getting closer to China and Russia than actually pursuing seriously a breakthrough for the JCPOA, as in, for the return of the United States to JCPOA. Is that sense correct, or is this just alarmist sort of, assessment?
Correct. As a matter of fact, the Raisi government and those experts providing him with policies, they are reasonable people. I mean, this is a government of rationality. For quite a long time, Iran has just stopped everything to see if the Americans would eventually remove the sanctions or not. But that's why the critics of President Rouhani's JCPOA-centered foreign policy elected Raisi, because they believe that we need to work with other countries from Latin America to Africa, China, and Russia, and do not miss the opportunity. But at the same time, we would not forget the JCPOA. As he said, JCPOA would be followed, but it would not play a pivotal role in the foreign policy of the new cabinet. But the era has changed. Iran has learned a lot. It has a lot of experience in the past decade. It now knows how to play against the containment strategy exercised by the United States. Also, it knows how to deal with talks and deals with the United States. It knows that the United States is not really up for a conflict resolution. It just wants to contain Iran. Therefore, Raisi has a more complete plan. They are, right now, they are assessing the conditions. Raisi, Amir Abdullahian, the foreign minister, they are lifetime diplomats or politicians, but they are new in area of decision-making over the JCPOA, so they want to have their own assessments. I believe in the first few rounds, as they have already stated, they would get back to Vienna in a couple of months, but they would first go for assessing the opposite side. If the United States continues to deny its undertakings the same way that it did under President Rouhani, then Iran, I believe, under President Raisi, would start a different strategy to make America comply with its undertakings. That entails, of course.
That's very interesting. I mean, that's very interesting. So you're basically saying that there is a review process going on. Let me get back to you with reference to that review process. But let me go back to Dr. Hever here. Dr. Hever, this whole idea of a military solution, whether it's the US, whether it's Israel, we just talked about, and you explained to us the nature and purport of the Israeli military chief's statement. But give me a sense of how you look at, this whole sort of talk about a military option, because from where I stand, given capabilities on all sides, including the Iranian capabilities, the idea of a military strike is going to create a near apocalypse in the Middle East. So is there some way of, identifying and sort of informing people that this kind of talk only leads to instability and also could possibly lead to a miscalculation.
Yeah, you're presenting the rational argument here. And of course, I completely agree with Dr. Greter that says that it is actually in the interest of the Israeli government to support the JCPOA. And this would be something in their interest, and their opposition to it is counterproductive. And if the JCPOA falls apart completely, that would be a disaster for Israel, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that the Israeli government acts rationally. The Israeli government acts out of a combination of populist reasons and fear and popular support for certain things and not for others. So this creates a kind of paralysis. The Israeli government made a very heavy gamble on the unconditional support of the United States. And with unconditional support from the United States, military actions against Iran are a little bit more thinkable, or it's something that they could possibly imagine that they would move forward. Without a very, very strong support from the United States, this is unthinkable. And this is something very important to understand. Indeed, some Israeli military personnel, generals, suggest that perhaps this is something that can be done through a kind of proxy war with in neighboring countries, in Syria or in Lebanon, where groups that are loyal to Iran would fight against groups that are loyal to Israel in a kind of simulation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, but on a smaller scale. This might be a reality if both Iran and Israel are nuclear powers. This is still not the situation. But at the moment where the Israeli government cannot rely on 100% support from the United States, their options are very limited. And right now, the United States is very much concentrated on the evacuation of Afghanistan, the loss of their war in Afghanistan that lasted for 20 years. You know, there was a list that was published now by the State Department of the United States of all the countries that they are thanking for their support in the evacuation efforts, and countries who accepted refugees from Afghanistan as part of their effort to help the United States and to help Afghanistan. One name is missing from that list: Israel. The state of Israel refused to accept even one Afghan refugee after the collapse of the U.S. military operation in Afghanistan. This is a very, I would say, low moment in the relationship between Israel and the United States. And within that context, I think the Israeli options are very limited, and the military action against Iran was something that is just fantasy.
That's an interesting point. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Shea Hever speaking with us. I am also joined by Dr. James Devine, who's Associate Professor, Department of Politics and International Relations at Mount Ellison University. Professor Devine, we were talking about the JCPOA, 6 rounds in Vienna, and now, as Mustafa Kusheshmu, who is on the panel, was just telling me that the Raisi government is actually reviewing what all has happened up until now. President Biden himself is sort of, involved in multiple crises at home, and also on the foreign policy front, not least this withdrawal from Afghanistan. So give me your sense of where you think things are headed.
It's difficult at this point. As you said, the Americans have their hands full with a number of other things. The Raisi government seems to be stalling. Just recently, they said that it could take them 2 or 3 months before they're ready to actually sit down and start negotiating. Whether it's, at this point, I think the Iranian side also thinks that they have a little bit of advantage in terms of time, that there's more pressure on the Americans to get a deal quickly. Therefore, if they stall, they're putting the Americans in a position where they're going to be more likely to make some concessions in order to get a deal. Because at this point, I don't think either side can really afford to have another failed round. This would be something to be very difficult, particularly on the American side. If Biden sits down once again with the Iranians, if not directly, indirectly, and the result is another stalemate or a lack of progress, there's going to be increasing pressure on him to basically say that the negotiations have failed.
So
they're going to be a little...
So, sorry, you're basically saying that the 7th round is around that no one really wants to get stalled, and so both sides would want it to succeed. So both sides, so the Iranians are stalling as per your assessment, and they want to get more concessions from the United States, and the US now wants to try and stitch the deal and get back into the deal ASAP.
That's right, and this is something they're gonna have to sort of work through a little bit. But there is a finite amount of time that the Biden administration can wait on this. Part of that is driven by the Israelis, because the Israelis don't have as much patience for the negotiations as the Americans do, and they continue to mount pressure on Iran and to continue to make bellicose threats about using the military option. So the Biden administration is getting squeezed from, in a sense, two directions: one from the Israelis, and also on the Iranian side. I would add to that also, I mean, there is opposition to these negotiations from the Republican Party, but also from within the Democratic Party itself. So again, there's more and more pressure on Biden to get something done, or to basically go back to Donald Trump's strategy of maximum pressure.
Professor Devine, very quickly, I'm also, almost running out of time. How credible do you think the Israeli military threats are?
At this point, they need to be taken seriously. But right now, I think the Americans and the Israelis have kind of agreed to play good cop, bad cop. And the threats are part of the American attempt to put pressure on the Israelis, right? So the Iranians are using time, and the Americans are using the Israelis to try and extract some concessions. In the longer term, it would be very difficult for Israel to use air power because of the distances involved and their lack of air refueling aircraft. But we could continue to see attacks like the one we saw in the Natanz, and the sort of shadow war continue, and more attempts at sabotage within Iran itself. Israel has shown it has the capability to do that.
Okay. Before I wrap up, Mustafa, I think Professor Devine is more or less saying what you said at the beginning of this program. So any final thoughts?
Well, as I was telling you, let me give you the final words, that Raisi and his administration, they are running an assessment about the conditions. They are thinking of, how to approach the Vienna talks, if they need to reshuffle the negotiating team or not, how much, and if they need to keep it under the foreign ministry, or they should transfer it back to the Supreme National Security Council as a responsibility, or once this is done, I mean, I believe they would go after the Vienna talks in about a couple of months. But the first few rounds or days of talks would give them a final assessment in order to calibrate their strategy. If they could get Americans to pay the dues, that it's very unlikely, then, okay, that's done. If not, then there are two calls, and I'm from the second group of calls. The first group say we need to call it quits and give it up altogether. The second group believes that we need to reshuffle our strategy, and this strategy should include more pressures on the United States through reinvigorating Iran's power components in missile and military areas, as well as nuclear industry and some other power components and leverages that Iran has, and also at the same time trying to reduce the pressures of the sanctions. And that's exactly where ties, strategic ties with Pakistan, China, Russia, and others comes into play. And that's exactly why Iran's membership in the Shanghai Organization matters a lot. So we have a plan to start a new strategy under the Vienna talks, I mean, in the framework of the Vienna talks. One last word. In this context, the Israelis, if they continue increasing threats, I'm thinking that they may eventually convince Iranian generals to shift their deterrence doctrine to a military doctrine of preemption and preemptive action. This is a possibility now.
When you say that, I'm also thinking as a minor student of military strategy that Iran could also have a forward deployment posture, and we know exactly where that deployment could possibly take place. But thank you so much. That was Syed Mustafa Khoshchesham. Thank you also to Professor Devine for his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss US-China relations. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Last Friday, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry wrapped up several days of meetings with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Tianjin. American climate officials say they had attempted to separate climate talks from the broader bilateral relationship. They say this was to avoid the type of antagonism that has typified recent attempts at U.S.-China dialogue. For instance, in July this year, Kerry's senior advisor Jonathan Pershing told U.S. lawmakers that climate talks had so far avoided sensitive topics. Climate and human rights abuses are things we distinguish and we can separate out, Pershing had said at the time. But the message from Wang was, no, you can't. According to a statement by China's foreign ministry, Wang told Kerry, and I quote from that statement, China-US climate change cooperation cannot be separated from the overall environment of China-US relations. Wang's comments reflect widespread discontent in Beijing toward what China's state media has repeatedly framed as American hypocrisy. To discuss this further, I am joined by Tangan, a political and economic affairs commentator based in Beijing, and Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Let me begin with Aina Tangan here. Aina, one of the things that critics are talking about is, with reference to the Chinese approach to this, is that, well, yes, there are problems, a number of problems in the bilateral relations, but climate change is something which needs to be looked at from a different perspective. Obviously, China doesn't seem to think that way. Give me your sense of what you think of the Chinese statement on this.
Well, China's statement was not an indication that it doesn't believe that climate change is a climatic issue. They do believe that. The issue is cooperation with the U.S. Remember, although China is the largest emitter, it has literally 3.5 times the population. But if you look at it on a per-person basis, the United States each person has twice as much of a climate footprint as they do in China. So, this kind of continued hypocrisy where the U.S. is saying that China needs to do this, that, and the other thing, whereas there is no commitment from the U.S. side. There's real concerns about the fact that over the last 5 years, evoked by the U.S. government, there's a question about reliability. Going forward. Obviously, if somebody's attacking you in Taiwan, it is very difficult to see how you're going to cooperate with each other on a climate project where you're being asked to give up much, while the other one being asked, the U.S., is not really doing anything.
Dr. Kamran Bukhari?
Ijaz, look, here's the problem. I mean, we can frame it as hypocrisy. We can frame it as whatever. The bottom line is that there's not much the Chinese can do without harming their economic model. It's the world's largest manufacturer, and that has a lot to do with the fact that it is the biggest emitter as well. And there's just no way right now, technologically, for the Chinese to not, emit, have those carbon emissions and sustain their economic model. It's export-driven economy. It's manufacturing goods that are exported. So then obviously you have to sell it in a certain way, and the way to sell it is, well, look, look what you're doing in Taiwan. Look what you're doing there. The bottom line is there is no way for the Chinese, and I'm being empathetic over here. I'm not being critical. I'm just saying that this is a bind that the Chinese find themselves in, and this is where we are until and unless there's something happens, which I don't see what can happen. There's just no way for the Chinese to pull back.
KB, I mean, here's the thing with reference to hypocrisy. You know that within the United States, the fossil fuel lobby, which is politically very strong and largely Republican, is opposed to a number of measures that need to be taken with reference to lessening the climate footprint. As Aina Tangen also said, that given the disparity in population size, if you look at the footprint of the individual American, that's 2 or 3 times more than that of Chinese. So I think something needs to be said about that also.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, and it's happening. I mean, there's an extremely heated debate in this country. Politics is polarized over climate in this country because there's freedom in this country to talk about it. And yes, there are those whose interests are tied. You mentioned the fossil fuel lobby. Yeah, of course. I mean, we have the same problem with the gun lobby in this country. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the Chinese are constrained, geopolitically constrained. How do you do one and not damage yourself on the other side? Whereas that's not the problem for the United States. In the United States, there's a debate going on, and the debate will lead somewhere. And the nature of the American Republic is as such that sooner or later, the Americans will have to find ways to address issues on the home front with regards to carbon emissions. So that I'm talking about sort of the fundamental difference between the Chinese state and how it deals with it and how the Americans are doing it.
Aina Tangen, you respond to what Kamran is saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I find it odd. The Chinese response is to do planning. They've set out their goals, and given past performance, they'll meet them. The U.S., as I said, and you somehow didn't address it, has had 3 different climate change policies, and if a Republican gets in there, there'll be another one. So all this talk about having free elections and people can talk about it, unless somebody does something, nothing will be achieved. So, I think a lot of people are kind of wondering what all this kind of freedom is going to do if, in fact, we can't live on this earth. And it's just not about China and the U.S. The U.S. polluted its way to success, as did Europe. They were the main causers of this, the incremental stuff that's happened since then. Yes, it's a larger world, bigger population. But the wealthy countries are not stepping up. I mean, you talk about the U.S. as if, having debate is how you solve something. But you have to put money, you have to put effort, you have to put planning, and there has to be consistency over a long period of time. And you just don't have that in the U.S. right now. So why would China say, oh, okay, we'll do exactly what the U.S. is trying to do? It's not a U.S. world. Right? China has its own priorities, and it's not about production versus everything else. And, I kind of bristle at this idea that China is willing to sacrifice its people. China's the one that's been moving its people out of the poverty. It's the one that's created an economy, created income. Now, you're trying to say that that's a trap and they can't do anything. Well, that's not true. If you look at what they're doing right now in terms of pushing their socialist agenda, they're more than half right down tech titans, the gaming industry, even over some burdensome tutoring industry that's cropped up here. So I think it's quite clear that China is able to make the hard decisions. The real question is what on earth is the U.S. going to do? And how could China work with a partner that's unreliable, doesn't plan, changes every 4 years?
Okay, final word. Kamran Bukhari, I did a program on climate. This was just after the climate committee report came out. And my panelists were very clear about the fact that the science is clear. It's the politics that's murky. So even from this debate between you and Aina Tangen, I can see that there are 2 levels of that sort of political murkiness. One is intrastate and the other is interstate. And it seems to me that despite fires in the US and, flash floods and excessive floods in China, geopolitics will still, unfortunately, trump the science of climate change.
Yes, and those are constraints, and it's not something that's hidden. There is no hidden agenda. It's very well known that in countries that have freedom, democracy, and the ability to debate and question the state, this is what happens. This is how you move forward. You don't move forward in a closed climate, a closed political system where you don't have national debate. And the idea of doing things is a process. You just can't have it top down. That's the Chinese way of doing things.
But frankly, lots of people would say that that's the way in which some of the most important emergency issues need to be tackled. I mean, look at the pandemic and the rest of it. But I understand there's obviously the other side which says let's have a debate. Except that those who are dealing with the planet say that we might already be pretty late on this. But thank you so much, Dr. Bukhari. Thank you also to Einar Tangen for his insights. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.